Well, I'm glad everybody's coming back. So we're studying how we got the Bible. And last week we looked at the fact that the Bible is an ancient book. And what does that mean? What do we learn about ancient books? How did they produce ancient books back in ancient times?
Manually.
It was a very manual process.
By ancient men.
Ancient methods, yes, ancient men. They may not have been ancient at the time, but they are now. Yeah. There were scrolls, like I heard someone say. Yeah, scrolls was a technologically advanced method that came along. We think of a scroll as a very archaic thing, but that was actually quite a technological advancement. You got to have something that could roll up and capture words and not, think about that. What they had
Stone and something chiseling.
they had stone and a chisel. Yeah, that didn't roll up very well. Yeah. Okay. What else did we learn about ancient books? A couple other small tidbits that are going to pop back up today that we'll make sure we cover. There were scrolls, there was stone.
They started writing a long time before Jesus.
Okay, yeah, there was writing a long time before Jesus. Maybe 3,000 years before. So there was writing that predates Jesus, that's for sure. We know that. There was language. There was methods for capturing it. It's kind of started out with stone, I guess you could carve in the dirt or the sand, but then the wind and the rain washes it away. So someone said, you need to come up with a way to capture it better. So, hey, stone doesn't get washed away very well. Let's chisel into that. That's kind of hard. So, difficult, it's heavy. Ooh, how about clay? Let's try that. That's kind of a stony thing. It can turn into stone, right? A little bit more transportable, a little bit lighter. And then they decided, hey, we have this cool plant that actually, if you rip it apart and glue it together, it makes something you can write on. That's kind of neat. But that kind of disintegrates easy and biodegrades and falls apart. And anybody ever keep lettuce around for a couple days and see what happens to lettuce after a couple days? About a week. It kind of rank. That's basically what's happening with a plant, right? It's a plant. They say, well, how about if we take maybe some animal skins and figure out how to maybe write on that? That's a little thicker. That's a little bit more durable, but that falls apart too after a while. But maybe we can figure out ways to put it together. We made a book out of it. Remember we saw the Roman Codex out of wood and wax and metal, right? So we saw the methods advance through. It's hard to believe it. We call it technological advancement at the time. They figured out a way to capture thoughts and ideas down in a more durable fashion, something that would last, something that you could replicate, something. Remember ancient scrap paper? What was that called? You talk about ancient scrap paper. What was it called?
Shards.
Shards of what?
Pottery.
Pottery, yeah, and pieces of broken pottery. It's like, well, hey, I can kind of etch on that, and that was called ostraca, and the word ostracized came from that because generally speaking, they wrote the names of people that were kicked out onto that. That's where the term ostracized came from. So there's lots of ways that ancient books were conceived and came about and captured and produced and archived, and so that really brings us to where we are today. The birth of the Bible, right? Once you understand that it's an ancient book, it was written with ancient methods by ancient people in ancient languages a long time ago. It helps us understand kind of the foundational element for where the Bible actually came from. So we've got a couple pages here. We may or may not get through all this today. If we don't, we'll just pick up where we left off next week. Everybody good? Awesome. So, the word Bible itself, we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Where does that word come from? What is that word?
Biblia.
Biblia. Yeah, which means what? Books. Books. It actually means books in Greek. Yeah, the word Biblia means books. So we took that word, kind of transliterated it a little bit, messed with it a little bit. Like the word baptism, that's a transliterated word. That wasn't an English word before. There wasn't English back when the word baptizo was conceived. So English kind of picked up that word and took a word, and we did the same thing with the word Bible. So and why do you think we're doing it in Greek? Anybody know where my bottle of water is? I'm looking at this wandered off someplace. There brought a bottle of water. It disappeared. Okay. Why do we pick up the word Biblia from Greek? Why that word? Hint, hint. We're going to be looking at this today. Why the Greek word? Mike? Put you on the spot.
Because the New Testament was written in Greek.
Oh, outstanding. 5 points for you and first one out of lunch. Very nice. First big answer of the day. It was the New Testament, the book, the Bible that moved into our language was a Greek language written book. So that's where this word comes from. We're going to really understand what that means here in a little bit. But there's a reason why that word kind of transliterated over into us and for us, because that was the book actually in its original form. So we talked a little bit last week about the forms of ancient books. When papyrus or leather were used, it was either turned into a roll or a scroll. And we talked a little bit about the fact that papyrus was in strips, right? Because these plants, remember we had pictures last week about the plants that looked like cattails or reeds or something like that growing in the shores there of the Nile. And they could take those plants and kind of peel them off into strips. And those strips could be laid together and glued together and made a big flat surface you could write on, and of course that was very nice for rolling up. So we saw that, and it was usually done on just one side in columns. Sometimes you'll see ancient writings, like this right here. It's in columns, 3 or 4 inches wide. So that was really good for a scroll, if you think about it, right? I wouldn't want to write in long ways on a scroll, right? The scroll all of a sudden becomes like 20 feet long. So it became natural to kind of write in columns, right? And I could just, as I roll this thing up, just keep moving along. And so I'm reading in these short, like almost like a newspaper, right? So you see where that form of writing actually is picked up from an early practice. Ordinarily, these would be no longer than about 9 to 10 inches tall and a maximum of about 35 feet. Now, if you think about that, that's pretty long. That's pretty lengthy. So if you think about some of the big books in the Bible, they're going to get pretty long, right? You see the maximum length of the book here, right? You see why it had a maximum length. You see why nobody wrote War and Peace, right? I mean, these books had a finite length because the means by which they were captured had to have a finite length to it. So we see why probably Luke and Acts were broken up into 2 separate books. There's an example. Just too big for one scroll, right? This was kind of one person's thought. Luke and Acts are one person's kind of streaming thought. So you really could make that just one big long book, but it's just too big, right? So that's probably why it was broken in half. Scrolls or rolls would have been circulated individually, and that would have given way. Oh, thank you so much. You're next in line at lunch. I'm sorry, just going to jump in line, Mike. Sorry, man. Sorry, dude. This definitely outscores a good answer. Thank you. So that gave way to the Codex. Remember the Roman Codex? I don't know if we have a picture of it. Yes. The Roman Codex. What is that? What is the Codex?
It's like a book.
It's a book. Not like a book. It is a book. Yeah. It is a. We were right. Usually it could be in parchment. Could be in wood. Something stiff like that. Paper was best for a scroll because you didn't have a way to bind it back then, right? This is a later invention where they were able to actually do a binding with a book with paper. But something that was very rigid, like parchment or wood, would be great for, tying together something like this, and it just, right, now I can write on both sides. Oh, cool, right? A scroll's kind of tough to do on both sides, right? It's like, why am I rolling? That doesn't really make sense. Something like this, I'm getting double the value out of a side, out of a piece of paper, a piece of parchment. So this codex, this writing tablet, this writing book came along, and then what happened was when the parchment got a little bit more advanced, they could fold them together into pages and stitch them. I don't think I have a picture of that, but you could have like a stitched codex rather than wood, which is kind of heavy and clunky, and now what can I really do with that? If I go to parchment, probably became the best form. Because again, I could write on both sides, it was more flexible, it was lighter, it could be stitched together. Not as durable as wood, but just much more transformative, much more possible to do what I wanted to do as far as writing a lot and making it something that could be passed around. So the result was a book that could be easily carried about, easily passed around, written on both sides. You can include several books into one now. I can combine 2 codexes into one, right? You see how that starts to work out? You see how you start to get gospels forming, right? Multiple books being tied together, or an individual's writings all being tied together. It really couldn't be done until you had a technology that allowed that to happen. It's really hard for us to understand that today. We think we're so used to this. Well, what's the problem? You just print out a bunch of paper, or put 2 files in an email, or buy a couple books on my library shelf. We just don't think about how that was impossible until somebody invented the means for it to happen, right? I mean, I just think when I go back in time in my mind, I think about these were major leaps in technology. And it also took money to make it happen, right? Somebody had to fund this. So there had to be some resources available to be able to produce these types of things. You just didn't go and buy tablets, and pens and Office Max like we do today, right? It's very difficult. It was expensive to do that kind of thing back then. So we know that papyrus was kind of the first, but it was not very durable. Then parchment, and the earliest existing texts of the New Testament are written in a codex. So the earliest ones that we have are in codex form, parchment stitched together into a folded book type of a format. When we look at the New Testament text here in a couple of weeks, we'll look at some of these in detail, but they are in that form. So that's the form. We look back in time now, farthest back we can go, either New or Old Testament are in that codex form. Yes?
What about the scrolls they found in Qumran? Don't they have some of the New Testament text? But that's a scroll, that's not a codex, right? They were scrolls.
I don't know which text you're talking about specifically. The Dead Sea Scrolls? Those aren't New
I think
Testament.
that's what she's referring to.
They're all Old Testament?
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls were all Old Testament writings. Yeah. We'll talk about that in a couple weeks. Yeah.
No, I just thinking of,
Yeah. The earliest New Testament, my voice is changing. The earliest New Testament scrolls or texts we have
texts we have.
are in a codex.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The scrolls, you're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, those are all Old Testament writings.
Old Testament,
Yeah.
okay,
Those date back about 200 BC.
gotcha.
Yeah, that's a great point though. We're going to look at that here in a few weeks for sure. Yes, Jim?
Well, if we're on that subject, they had said that people had written the Old Testament after the New Testament happened.
Who says that?
People,
People?
skeptics,
Okay.
or whatever, supposed experts.
Okay.
And then they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, which
Right.
they have copies that are
Yeah.
older than they said it
Yeah.
written.
There's a few discoveries that have happened, fairly modern discoveries, that just kind of shook a lot of, conventional wisdom into dust, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are one of them. I mean, that was one of those things where I don't think it was an accident those were found when and where they were found. And we're going to look at that here in a few weeks. I think we see that. I don't think it's an accident. It's kind of like you left something in the perfect spot to be discovered at the perfect time. When they talk about the fullness of time, I think that's what we're talking about. Sort of like that. Yes?
So that makes more sense with the word Bible, because Bible comes from the
Greek.
Phoenician city Byblos, which was the papyrus exporter at the time. So a codex would make more sense.
Well, the Codex was a Roman, the Latin word.
Yeah, but still, it's more pressed sheets together rather than a scroll.
Yeah.
And that's why, they put the New
Thank you, sir.
Testament together, that would make more sense where the word Bible came from.
Yeah, just because that was their word. I mean, remember, the Greeks weren't necessarily sitting around thinking about Christ, right? They were in their
Right.
language, and I don't want to jump.
But Byblos was the city where papyrus was
Because we're the-
exported in Phoenicia.
It's where the
And that was Latin and Greek for
Yeah, it was where
the word Bible.
Byblos, that place was where the paper that made books came
It
from.
came
So
from.
yeah,
So they named
yeah, during
that codex
Yeah.
Byblos.
World War II, the Soviets had a city called Tankograd, where they made tanks.
You need to learn the president
Yeah.
off because she'll go on and on.
Okay, got it. So yeah,
I need to sit by him.
but now I want to separate you two. But I love the fact that we have origins of things coming from a purposeful origin. It isn't a word somebody made up,
Yeah,
right? Somebody made, this is a purposeful word, and it goes back to the origins of the thing itself, the substance that the book was made out of itself, which is paper. So wonderful, or papyrus. Thank you very much for that. That's actually very, very good. So, so early form of the Bible. We talked about this too in our introduction week, that God's first commandment to humankind was oral, right? There was an oral tradition here. It was passed down through God speaking directly to people, and He spoke directly to the patriarchs, right? We have lots of writings in the Bible about that. But then we had the early writers. Like, we don't have anything that Noah wrote, right? Or Adam wrote, or Abraham wrote. We don't have the writings of Abraham, right?
We don't have anything thing that Jesus wrote.
Okay, there you go. Well, oh, sorry about that. That's a good point. That's a very good point. Very good point. We have his words. That's a good point. But we don't have the writings of Abraham, Noah, and Adam, right? God, there was a oral tradition there, speaking directly to them, through them. And we're talking about a period of time of 2,500 years or so, right? Where it was an oral tradition of capturing God's word and God's direction. Because think about the society at that time. Think about the society of Noah and Abraham. What was it? What were those? What did Abraham, what was the geopolitical structure? What were they? What was it?
He was sort of a nomad.
It was kind of tribal, right? It was family, right? Even up through Jacob. I mean, it was a very family thing, right? You had the head of the household passing through what he knows to the family, right? So it worked. When did all of a sudden that not work anymore? When mankind moves into a different kind of society, right? A nation state type of society. Well, now, hold on. It's not a...
More and more people.
Yeah, more people, right? Organized, right? So just that as society changed, the method had to change. So we see that throughout God's word being revealed, right? We see what happens. Why, the word stopped. The revealing stopped with the prophets at the right time, and then picks back up again at the right time when you have society has the right infrastructure in place to make it work. And what if Jesus had come along 400 years earlier? I mean, I guess God could accomplish anything, but mankind, we're the creation. It's doing it through us, right? So you have peace in Jesus' time, right? You have political stability, right? You have a transportation system that allows people to move around this area in peace without going across through warring borders and things like that. So you have the perfect fullness of time for the message of Jesus to come. And you have a language that everybody speaks, everybody understands, right? It was kind of like Greek was like English at that time. If you wanted to communicate to the world, you wrote in Greek. Just like today, if you want to communicate to the world, it doesn't do any good to write in Portuguese. I love Brazilian and Portuguese people, but it doesn't do any good to write a language, to write a revealing message in Portuguese. I can't. Most of the world can't read it, doesn't understand it. It's got to be translated. Oh, what happens when I got to translate it? Uh-oh. If you write the thing in English, your thought comes out in English. Most of the world can get it. And I'm going to translate from that. Right? Well, that was the same thing that happened here. Greek was the language. It was because of Alexander the Great and just the Greek, dominance of the known world at that time. That language became the language that could go throughout the whole known world at the time. So I think that's just amazing that the times, the things that happened at the absolute right time. Dale, do you have a thought?
Well, it became much more important as society grew and people gathered in larger groups. If anybody's ever played the telephone game back in school,
yeah,
you had to have it in writing because by the time it went from one guy to the last guy, it was a different message. So unless you had something that could be accurately passed from one to another, it would change.
Yeah. And the Hebrews had an amazing method for making sure that written thing was captured and passed along perfectly. We're going to look at that too in a few weeks. So, unbelievable process. And the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that process to be completely accurate. So that's what's amazing about that. So great point. Thank you. Yes, Mike.
And I want to say this, and I agree with you in the fullness of time, the Greek language being the universal language, because they have specific words, like they got 4 words for love, where you say love in English, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Love in Greek, you knew what type of love you were talking about.
Yeah. It was the right language to do
Right
it.
language
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. So that's amazing that God He allowed people to come along and this obviously ungodly people develop this language that He used,
Yep.
right, to communicate to His people then and now. And if we have doubts about it, go get a Greek lexicon and look up the Greek word. Yeah, what did that writer mean? Oh, he meant that. So that's amazing. Using the Romans were not ungodly people, but man, let's use their roads. I feel the same way about the computer. I don't know anything about the man or people that invented the computer, but I'm going to use it for God's purpose. Same with that video camera. I don't think about the people that invented that thing, but I'm going to use it. God gives us He gives us the intellect, no matter if they're godly people or not, to develop technology and to come up with new ideas and ways that we can leverage for His purpose. So I think that's amazing. So the early writers, if we look back in the Bible, there's 6 distinct writings that are attributed to Moses. This is probably around 1500 BC. I don't know if you ever are interested in times, years, dates. I think it's fascinating, actually. I think it's very helpful to understand when things took place, when things happened. To know that David lives somewhere around 1050 BC, Moses somewhere around 1500 BC. That means Joseph probably went somewhere around 1900, 2000 BC. I think it's really, really interesting and helpful to understand when things happened, when things took place. So the earliest writings that we have that are attributed to writers in the Bible was around 1500 BC. So this is 2500. This is 3,500 years ago. And we have a list here in the outline of some things that are specifically attributed to Moses himself. That we know, that the Bible tells us Moses wrote these things. Jewish tradition and writers of other books and the Lord himself, give Moses credit for writing the first 5 books of the Bible. And that's called the Pentateuch. A couple different names for that, Pentateuch. So obviously Penta is 5, right? So 5 books. And here are the different places in the Bible where it gives Moses credit for writing that. The Mosaic Law, we've heard that referred to before, right? So the Pentateuch was the law. Those 5 books were the law. The Torah, right? Those are God's direction and commandment, his historical account of the origins of mankind. I think that's really, really fascinating. If you believe the Bible is an inspired book and it came from God, that's God's account of the origin of mankind. That's it. That's his account. I'm going with it. Yeah, I'm going with it, right? Everything has got to jive with that. If somebody's got a different account, that's man's account. This is God's account of the origins of mankind. And writers often refer to their successors in their writings, right? Joshua wrote, in the book of the law of God. This became a practice of men who wrote history and prophecy. We see that in Samuel and Jeremiah. Later writers are found consulting the writings of their predecessors. We saw that in Daniel and Nehemiah. And this caused the Old Testament scriptures to gradually grow and become assembled into a collection. This happened around the time of Ezra. So you see, as you read the Old Testament, you hear, right, you see reflections of people and past writings and Moses and all that. But when did it actually start to become a unified collection of books? That was somewhere around 400 BC. Now that year, that time frame is not a coincidence. What happens right around then? Okay?
Jews returned from captivity.
Jews are returning from captivity.
Temples rebuilt.
Temples rebuilt. What else happens?
There's no word from the prophets.
It stops, right? God's word ends. The revealing of word ends. He's done, right? I've said it. It's done. Better get it organized. Better bring it all together. Better get it organized because something else is going to happen here pretty soon, right? What else is going to happen in the snap of history's fingers? Jesus is going to come along pretty quick, right? I would love to do a study on the intertestamental period. Very fascinating. I don't think we as Christians study that and understand enough of what happened in there. It answers a lot of questions. Where did Jesus' language come from? Jesus didn't speak Greek. I'm sure he could speak Greek, but he didn't walk around speaking Greek. He didn't walk around speaking Hebrew. Why did he speak a different language? That period of time it answers that. Where does synagogue come from? That time period answers that. Where do these Romans come from? All of a sudden you get done reading the Old Testament. Oh, okay, looks pretty. And all of a sudden you flip over to Matthew and there's these Romans. Where'd that come from? How'd that happen? Right? What happened there? That study that period of time answers all of that. Who's this Herod guy? Where'd that come from? Right?
Isn't this also where the Greeks started slowly
Where the
starting
Greeks?
their power?
Well, where'd the Greek? Well, Greek, where'd that come from? How did we go from Hebrew to Greek? How'd that happen?
Yeah.
The study of that period of time answers all those questions for you. So if you don't understand that, it's kind of like the record skipped or something. Like I fell asleep during a chapter of this. What happened? Right? So it's really important to study that, and then someday I'm sure with the Elder's Blessing we can maybe look at that, because it does start to fill in a lot of gaps of our understanding. I see that now. With a lot of the things that were happening in the New Testament explains the behavioral practices there. So this started to be assembled into a collection around the time of Ezra. Before that, they were individual scrolls, individual writings, books, kind of floating around, right? Remember, you kind of went from this oral tradition that lasted for 2,500 years to a writing revealing over time of about 1,100 years, right? God's people have been through a lot in that 1,100 years. Think about what they've been through. Captivity, they've been through their own nation, captivity again, restoring back home again. They've been through a lot, right? So now it's like, hey, we're back again, we're home, let's go this collected. And so this starts to happen around that time. They don't know it. I mean, they might be looking for the Messiah very, very soon. That's another thing. There's all kinds of things about their mind. Glad to be home, don't know what's really going to happen. And then the Jewish historian Josephus did state that no book was added to the Hebrew Scripture after the time of Malachi, and that's true. The Hebrew Bible that's existed since 400 BC is exactly the same as it is today. There have been no additional writings that they've included, no additional books. And I think that's pretty cool too, that there's been nobody else come along and say, in the Hebrew line of writing, nobody added anything after that. It ended there. They've been preserving it ever since. Thoughts, comments so far? That's Paige. What do you think? What do you think about when you ponder on these thoughts?
That God is still in control.
Still in control. Yep, God is not a victim, he is a player. And one of my bosses told me that a long time ago. Be a player, not a victim. Don't react, proact. God is proacting, right? He is playing in the game of mankind. He's active. Yeah, you can see it. There's no like, oh, woe is me, this is happening to me. No, it's, hey, I'm going to use this stuff. Mankind goes off, does this, I'm going to use that. And I think it's amazing the timing of things are not coincidental. So the Old Testament was written in about 1,100 years span, something like that, 1,050, 1,100 years span of time. The Old Testament was written. A lot of different writers there. How many books in the Old Testament? 39. Yep. And those are the original 39 books. We're going to look at it here in a second. They're arranged a little differently in the Hebrew Bible, but they're exactly the same books. In exactly the same words, by the way. New Testament was written from about 50 to 100 AD. What do we know about the life of Christ? When did Christ live?
When did he live?
When did he live?
You mean, are we talking like from the very beginning?
Yeah, when did Christ live? What were the years that Christ lived?
4 to 6 BC to
Somewhere around
29.
4 BC, you're right, 4 to 6. We're not absolutely certain. Probably, you can hear arguments of both. I'm digging with the 4 BC number, personally. 4 BC to about what?
To somewhere around 28.
Yeah. I've seen etched in some Churches of Christ outside, established AD 33. there's obviously that date might not be correct. It's probably 28. And there's some it's because of some calendar malfeasance that happened over the centuries. Why that date got a little off. But probably 4 BC to about 28 AD, somewhere in that range there. Which is why you can't. The BC thing is like somebody tried to establish it. I mean, think about that. You had, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Romans, all had calendars, right? They all had their own calendar. Today, there's countries today that have their own calendar, by the way. So it's like time zones. Countries actually, there's some countries that have their own calendar. So in their world, they might track it when their emperor came to power. That's their calendar starts over, stuff like that, right? The whole world did not have a common calendar. It was much later where you start to get a common calendar in place. Well, okay, now I got to rearrange. Well, when did your year 59 realign with my year 806? And that's really hard to think about that. It makes my brain bleed just thinking about trying to get all these calendars lined up, right? So there was an attempt at one point to say, well, Jesus was 1, but they found out they weren't quite right. It's more like 4 minus, -4, right, in reality. If we're going to use 2021 as a tick backward time, it probably is off by about 4 years. So it's about 4 BC, about 28 AD. So the New Testament starts to be written about 50. What's that tell you?
He'd been gone a while.
Yeah, this is a few years afterward. This is not like immediately. Matthew didn't sit down and saw. Anybody watching The Chosen? One. I hold my hand high. I like that show. It's following the Jesus chosen followers. And it shows Matthew running around writing stuff down, and John's writing stuff down. That's kind of funny. I think it's kind of funny. It didn't actually start to be captured until somewhere around 25, 30 years later. That you started to have the first writings start to be captured, where God started to reveal, direct these men to start writing the stuff down. Obviously, it was mostly letters written by inspired men addressed to different churches. There were a lot. I will say this: there were a lot of writings. There were a lot of writings that took place at that time. There were a lot of writings that took place during the intertestamental period, and we're going to find out when we start to study the canon of the scriptures why some of those writings didn't get included, didn't make the cut, why we don't still have, why they are not in our Bible today. So it's kind of like I can sit here and write all day long, but you're not going to probably immortalize my writings, right, Mike?
I would consider it.
Yeah, that's nothing else to read. So there's reasons why some of these writings by other people didn't make the cut, right? They didn't stick around. They didn't look back and go, I'm not too sure there was much inspiration in that, right? But there were a lot of writings that took place, all right? And they were exchanged between churches. They were passed around, right? I mean, think about it. What if you had Mark's original gospel? You're in possession of Mark's original writings. Matthew's original. What you have in John's original gospel? The man that walked with Jesus. I got it right here. What are you going to do with that?
Have someone make a copy of it.
Copy it down! Right, copy it down. Because what do we understand? Well, why did we talk last week about ancient books? They deteriorate. They're going to fall apart. Hey, someone else wants it over here, and if it, I got to get to you. I got a group heading off this way. Or the church starts to be scattered and persecuted. They're going to go off in the brick. We need to have this. You better copy this thing down, right? You better make copies of this. And they didn't have a mimeograph machine. Remember the mimeograph machine? Yeah. I love in school. They passed out the test. What'd you do when you first got the test?
Smell it.
Oh, we did, right? Yeah. So they didn't have mimeograph machines. And those are ancient, right? We didn't have copies. You're going to have to copy this thing now. You have to make copies of this thing. So let me get this straight. Human beings, men probably, are going to sit down and make handwritten copies of something.
Scribes.
That makes me really nervous. Is anyone else nervous about that? About the
Mistakes.
Yeah. I'm not too. Okay, so let's make a bunch of copies at once. How about we do that? How about if I've got Matthew's original gospel here, okay? And this is the room of leaders that are going to go out. We're going to drive the gospel message out. We're going to make copies of this. George, would you mind just making about 50 copies of this, please?
Sure.
Handwriting 50 copies of this. First of all, how long is it going to take him? It's going to take him forever. And how many mistakes is he going to make?
Watch.
He's going to make a bunch of mistakes, right? And he's going to give up, right? Some of us have to leave before he's done. How about if we all make the copies at the same time? How about if we all make the copies together, right? What's that going to do?
Gives you a chance to compare them.
Compare? Very good.
More uniform.
More uniform because, Jim might make a mistake that Ron doesn't make, but when we compare, we go, uh-oh, Jim, you missed a word, you misspelled that, or wrong gender, or whatever, right? That's right. So we have a chance to do that. We get them quicker too, right? So there's a lot of benefit to that. That's probably how it happened. Ancient scribes were usually sitting in a scene like this, writing on their knees, right? And it was probably dictated, right? So somebody's going to sit here and read it out loud, and these guys are going to copy it all down, right? So there is an opportunity for error here.
But
Okay.
No, there's not.
What's that?
There's not.
Well, hang on a second. This makes my big question. Were these guys inspired?
no,
No.
they were hired.
They were hired. Yeah, I like that. Hired, not inspired. I like that. But it's the word we have today. Hang on just one second, Jim. We're basing everything we do and say in the church on this thing right here that I say is the inspired word of God. But this is 1,000 generations removed from that. This is not only not that, this was translated several times. This brings an interesting dilemma. We're going to look at this over the next few weeks, right? That how do I have confidence that this goes back to that original Gospel of Matthew?
Providence of God.
Okay, the providence of God. I think there is something there. And we're going to, now that's easy to say without any evidence, right? It's easy to say, oh, it's God's providence. Well, how do you show me that? That's
Compare it with the ancient things.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And that's the real miracle, I think, when we find things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other ancient New Testament manuscripts that have been discovered. We look back and we say, hey, I've got this thing that the Catholics use, and they translated into Latin, and it was compared to the Septuagint that these Hebrew people translated into Greek, and then you got English comes along, and King James, and all those guys arguing, fighting. How do I know it's accurate? I go and I find this 1,800-year-old manuscript buried someplace in a monastery, and I crack it open. Oh, by the way, it's in Greek, and it's exactly right. That's how I know there was something working behind the scenes here,
Okay.
right? That I don't think these guys were inspired. I think there was some guidance there, just like our elders, right? Are elders inspired? Are they inspired men? What are they?
Just man.
Just men, doing the best they can, praying to God for guidance and direction, right? Hoping to not make mistakes that aren't irreparable, doing the best they can, following what they think is God's direction for them.
Just like all of us do.
Just like all of us do. Right, but have you seen what I'm saying though? And so, if people do that, things work out. Right? The word is intact and whole. It's like our ministers, our elders, anyone who's passing and driving this word forward. Right? So, are there some elders that go bad? There's some preachers that go bad. There's some members that go bad. Yeah. But it doesn't discredit the ones who are trying and driving forward with God's direction, right?
That's why you don't place your faith in people.
I place faith in the drive and the guidance. Right. I'm sorry, yes, you had a thought.
No, it was exactly what she said. That's
Okay.
why I said, no, there's not.
Thank you. Jim?
God made sure that what needed to be written was written properly. Whether it was some lackey who was paid
Yeah.
a ruble once a month.
Yeah.
You know?
I think he does it through think about how the church is structured, especially how we believe the church organization should be structured. We talk about plurality of eldership, right? We talk about plurality of congregations, right? We don't believe in bringing all the congregations in under one head. Why?
Jesus is the head.
Yeah, but why not have a man head? Why not make George head of the entire Church of Christ body a little bit? Why not do that?
It's not scriptural,
Why not? Why do you think it's not scriptural? Why?
because it doesn't work.
Christ is our
It
head.
doesn't work.
It's probably not a good idea. I mean, if you think about it, it's like, well, what happens if George goes off the rails, right? What happens if George gets corrupted? George, I love you, brother. Right? But what happens, right? If it's all placed in one person, one guy is going to make 20 copies. Is that a good idea? How about if we all make copies? How about if we're all part of the royal priesthood, right? How about if we're all, if something goes wrong over here, it doesn't,
In fact,
infect, great word, the entire body, right? That's God's providence in action, if you think about it. So we can stand back and look at the entire thing over time and say, hey, there was a couple of things that went wrong here and there, but overall, look what it's kind of like why you have more than one person on a jury, right? I want what is the consensus of thought here? What is the meaning here in the long run, the big span of things? I feel that there's God's providence in the direction. He set it up for us to work right. Yeah, Jim?
They took their job very seriously
Mhm.
and realized how important it was, so they were trying to do a very good job.
Yeah.
There are people who study this sort of thing, and there are certain types of errors that can be made and are made. And if you're sitting with the text and copying it, there are certain errors, like you could leave out a word or put the same word twice. For instance, going from one line to the next,
Obviously an error.
something
Yeah.
like that. But if you're dictating, then you have hearing errors.
Mhm.
You know, you can hear the wrong thing
Yeah.
or whatever. And so,
Think of the pressure on the guy dictating it. He better have good diction Better than mine. Better talk a lot slower and clearer than I do, right? So these people understand. But you're right, they were professionals. I think someone said they were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to do a good job. And the amazing thing is, as time has gone on, after the revealing of the word ended, centuries go by, we find evidence that validates it. There is the amazing thing to me. It's like, okay, you want validation? Here it is. 2,000 years later, bang. Questions, anybody? You know, it's kind of that thing. It validates it. Okay, I don't have any questions. Right? You got to really reach to find questions. Yes?
And when they do compare the older ones with the later ones,
Mhm.
there are errors, but they're so minuscule. I mean, so unimportant and easy to figure out.
Yeah.
That
I don't want to jump too far ahead, but if you jump to the book of Matthew or book of Mark in your Bibles, it's going to look at this in a couple of weeks when we start to look at texts. Book of Mark. Just go to the very end, where that chapter 16. Just check something real quick here. There's a chunk in Mark at the end, starts in verse 9 and goes to the end of the book. Now, my version has it in double parentheses. Does yours have anything?
Mine
Any
says
notes?
The longer ending of Mark.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the longer ending of Mark. Yeah. So, again, don't want to. This is kind of a teaser for a few weeks from now. But here's an example of where all the manuscripts didn't jive.
Right.
There were enough of the old manuscripts that had verses 9 through 19 or 9 through 20 in them that we say we're pretty sure of it. We're pretty good. Confidence is pretty high. Not as high as the entire book, the rest of the book, but pretty high that is original writing. But there's a few old manuscripts that do not contain that.
Two.
Yeah.
Mine actually tells me the two codexes.
Yeah, and we're gonna look at this. We're gonna look at those old manuscripts, and there's three big ones. There's three like Mount Rushmore of old manuscripts that we're gonna look at. Okay, two of them don't have it. One of them does, and a bunch of other lesser manuscripts do have it. So because those two really old ones don't, these translators here put that in double parentheses and want to let you know, hey, FYI, some old manuscripts don't have that. So now you as a reader, do what you want. That's okay with me because there's enough of them that do have it that I feel like, well, where did it come from? It had to come from somewhere, and it got circulated. And one theory is that one manuscript is kind of partially missing at the end, so it's like that could be why, or it could have gone to another scroll or another parchment or something. So it just could have been like pages fell out. Like, could you imagine if I had a Bible and took a big chunk out of it? Would you also say that's not inspired because my Bible's missing that chunk? It's just missing it because it got torn out. Could be something like that. We don't know for sure. But the translators and the assemblers here put that in a place for you to say, hey, just FYI, here's an example where not everything jives.
But there's nothing unscriptural about those verses.
But yeah, we're relying on the original compilers, the original canon effort to have that confidence.
Right.
So I'm going to say, yeah, the guys who did all of this made that decision, so I'll go with it. Right? Because they put these 66 for me. They might have left out. They left out a bunch of others.
Right.
They decided to put that in with a note. I'm good with that. Yeah, wrap us up, Jim. What do you got?
Well, if it's at the end, it could have been damaged, lost, or whatever.
Right. Right. So there's an example where we're not. It's in enough of them where we have pretty good confidence. But FYI, be advised, there's a couple really old ones that don't have it. Okay, so that's one of those things, right? And that's probably the best example you'll find is that one at the end of Mark. Any other thoughts? We're going to wrap up, and we'll pick this up where we left off next week. We're going to look at the Bible today and the structure of it. So, any other thoughts, comments before we wrap up? You've been awesome. Keep being awesome. Have a good day. Happy Father's Day to you fathers.